In the history of war, trench warfare is perhaps unsurpassed in terms of sheer horror and brutality. With each side dug into tough defensive positions, trench warfare allows for agonizing stalemates where very little ground is won or lost, but it's no less deadly. In this video, I'm making a trench table to play wargames on, and in doing so, we'll learn something of the realities that real soldiers endured in these hellish conditions. Let's dive in. My plan for this board is to split it into 3 parts, each one measuring 2 feet by 4 feet with its own dedicated video. The first part, which we'll make in this video, will be a network of trenches. The middle segment will be a scarred and horrible no man's land, and the third will be a more fortified position of trenches and bunkers dug into a hill. I'm going to be using this table mostly for battles of Warhammer 40k and Horus Heresy, but I want it to closely reflect the realities of trench warfare in World War I. If you're interested in the history of the Great War and trench warfare, then you might enjoy the sponsor of today's video, Supremacy 1914. Supremacy 1914 is a free cross-platform PvP online strategy game set during World War I. You can play your favorite nation either on browser or mobile in real time on historic maps. I like that this game puts you in the shoes of the highest levels of command, overseeing the movements and production of armies, supplies, and resources. Since the game is in real time, there's a real sense of tension that builds as you declare war, form alliances, and use ever-evolving strategies to win epic battles. If you click on the link in the description in the next 30 days, you'll get an exclusive gift of 15,000 gold and 1 month of premium subscription for free. Now let's get into building this table. The first thing I had to do was build the frame for the 3 board sections. I did this using some 2-inch pine posts for the frame with a masonite surface. The key here is a compromise between weight and rigidity. I had them cut the posts to length for me at Home Depot on the saw they have in the store, but be careful if you aren't experienced with wood before you do something like this. If you're not experienced with woodworking, you might not know that a so-called 2-inch post will not be 2 inches by 2 inches because they plane them on each side in the sawmill, leaving more like 1.5 inches by 1.5 inches. So don't just do the math in your head. Don't trust what they're billed as in the store, always measure. Anyways, with the basic substrate finished, I lay out some 2-inch thick insulation foam across the whole board. Before I sketched my trench layout, I did a little bit of research on how trenches are typically laid out. A common arrangement is to have multiple lines of trenches on the front. The foremost trench, called the front line trench or firing trench, has a crenellated appearance from above. This is due to the frequent U-shaped detours in the trench called traverses that prevent shrapnel or projectiles from traveling too far down the line and prevent the enemy from easily clearing out a whole trench with enfilading gunfire if they capture a section. Zigzagging back from the front line are communication trenches, which allow easy reinforcement and communication to the front lines while still providing cover. Behind are the support trenches, which were typically a little bit safer, less likely to be hit by artillery, and often several hundred yards behind the frontline trenches. For my design, I made a frontline trench curving across the board, with traverses at regular intervals. Most often trenches would be straight across long frontages, but I think this curved shape will be more interesting to play on. As I mentioned, support trenches are usually hundreds of meters behind, but I compressed this design so I could have some of the features of the support trench. One of the parts of my support trench here will be visible in cross-section from the edge of my table, and it'll allow you to get down at table level and really feel immersed in the trenches. It's going to be really cool, you'll see. I added some communication trenches zigzagging their way to the front. I only had room for 1 zig or zag, depending on which you prefer, I guess, but that's okay. I also blocked in some bridges. These have the dual purpose of allowing cavalry and carts to easily cross the trench while also providing some shelter from shrapnel coming from above. Lastly, I blocked some of the craters of various sizes, representing the blown out areas where shells and explosives had hit. I also roughly sketched out some areas that might be good for barbed wire or tank traps. When I was satisfied with the layout, I started cutting out the trenches with a sharp work knife, angling the blade so the trench walls aren't completely vertical. The walls of the trench will be covered later, so I didn't need to worry about the cuts being particularly clean. Now, real-life trenches are often quite narrow. Obviously, you don't want extra space for shells to fall into your trench. But since I would be using this for wargaming, I needed to make sure there was enough room for squads of minis to move into the trench sections. So the trenches are a bit wider than real-world trenches, but not too wide. I still wanted tanks to be able to drive right over them. That is, after all, the point of tanks. Now, once I was happy with the layout, I used construction adhesive to glue down the foam sections. Once they were secure, I cut the craters out with a sharp blade. Now this could have been done more easily before gluing, to be honest, but oh well. The deepest one has a flat bottom because I wanted it to be filled with standing water eventually. Now generally, trenches are deep enough for soldiers to stand upright without their heads sticking up over the top, which is why the frontline trench needs to have a fire step, a raised place for soldiers to stand to fire their guns over the lip of the trench. In real life, this is a small ledge, but again, I'm widening it to accommodate the bases of miniatures. I used some classic Perry Brothers soldiers shooting their lasguns to make sure the height was just right. I also cut this doorway into one of the trenches to represent a dugout. This is an area where soldiers can take shelter underground for periods of heavy shelling. This is one of the reasons that World War I was so deadly. It was a clash of new and old fighting technologies and philosophies. At the Battle of the Somme, for example, the British dropped a huge amount of anti-personnel shells on the German position before advancing, but the Germans were sheltering in deep dugouts. These shells dropped were largely designed for the warfare style of the 19th century, where lines of troops would meet each other in the open battlefield, and were designed to kill people with shrapnel rather than destroy fortifications. So once the shelling stopped, the Germans simply emerged from their dugouts and manned the trenches. The advancing British soldiers were caught in the open, charging without cover into nests of machine guns and rifle fire. After just one day, 20,000 British soldiers were dead, and by the time the battle was over, there were over 1 million casualties in just this one battle. It's hard to fathom the scope of the loss and tragedy involved in World War I. In Canada, even the smallest towns have a memorial to the Great War, often listing the names of the casualties. Sometimes kids as young as 16 and 17 who lied about their age to enlist and fight for their country. I know this is heavy, but I bring this up because it's supremely important to remember that even while we make games of war, we must never glorify it, and we must never forget the horror, the tragedy, and the utter waste of life that war is. War is hell. Never forget. We owe the dead that much. Anyways, let's get back to it. For the next step, I took a trip to the dollar store to buy some rolls of tinfoil. I'm going to use this foil to create embankments around the trenches. These are the piles of dirt excavated from the trenches when they were dug that's piled outside for additional protection. Using a glue gun, I put tinfoil around the edge of every trench and the craters as well. Okay, at this stage you can see we're starting to get those built up edges around the trenches, which would be all that loose dirt that's thrown out when they dig those trenches. And you can see we've got some loose earth cast up around the craters as well. I'm starting to think the best thing to do is to lay down a layer of mud texture here and then add details on top and then come in with more mud texture at the end to finish it off. So let's do that. All right, we're about to film outside here, putting some mud on here. You can see I'm wearing my not best clothes. Let's see if we can beat the rain. It looks like a good chance of showers. I can feel raindrops on my skin right now, so let's do this quickly. So, to make a mud coating for the whole board, I use a mixture of acrylic latex caulking, a splash of isopropyl alcohol to thin it down, brown house paint, sand, and grout. I mix that thoroughly until the components are blended together, then with an old paintbrush I slap that mixture on everywhere, pushing it into cracks and crevices and laying it on especially thick where there are small gaps in materials I want to fill. I didn't take any specific measurements of the various materials, but if you guys ever want to ask me any questions about techniques, the best place to do it is on my Discord server, which is accessible to my Patreon patrons. I try to answer questions I get in the comments and emails as well, but I give priority to my patrons because they're supporting me, and they're the best. Now the caulking has a really strong vinegary smell that's actually quite gnarly, but watching it back from the comfort of my editing station, it kind of looks like a giant chocolate cake. Delicious. So with the mud on the trenches, I'm pretty stoked with how it's looking right now, but we can add a ton more detail to this. The walls of the trenches need to be supported with what are called revetments to prevent them from collapsing. Similar to a retaining wall, revetments are made from a variety of materials, from wood planks to woven wattle to sheet metal. I decided most of my trenches would be made from sheet metal because I thought it would be the fastest to construct. To make this sheet metal, I used some corrugated paper, which I painted with some gray and silver spray paint. I'll put a link in the description to this paper and all the other materials I use in this project, so you can get some of your own if you like. I made a pretty big mistake here, and I only painted one side of the paper, which I regretted later. If you decide to make something inspired by this build, paint both sides. Trust me on this. Now once painted, I cut the metal sheeting and braced the walls of the trenches. My instinct was to make the grooves vertical, but all the reference photos I saw showed horizontal, so we'll go with that. I let the paper overlap the top of the trench by a small amount, and I made some stakes holding back the revetments with a bit of bamboo skewer. If I were to do this again, I would definitely paint the stakes before gluing them on. I had to paint them individually later on, and it was a real pain. For the fire step, I braced it as normal, but added some small holes in the base of the metal. This is to represent what's called a grenade sump, a small hole that you can kick an enemy grenade into, which contains the blast and could save your life. I started adding duck boards using some cut up coffee stir sticks, checking with minis again to make sure the heights are looking good. It was around about here that I realized how much trench I had to cover and how labor intensive it was going to be, but sometimes you just have to grit your teeth and get it done. You can see here the colors showing on the back of the metal revetments I was talking about. Obviously this was a big mistake. I had to come back in and manually try to paint them so they didn't show up. I continued laying in some duck boards on the trench floor, using coffee stir sticks, and it was taking a really long time. These stir sticks are made from a wood that's pretty hard, much harder than say balsa wood for example, and my hand was beginning to hurt from snipping so many small sticks with my clippers. I decided to shift to a different material to save time and energy. This time I used expanded PVC board. It's about the same thickness, and once painted it should look roughly the same. I texture it with a wire brush, then cut it in a grid pattern to the desired dimensions. This approach is much faster than cutting stir sticks. I then started assembling sections of duck board outside of the trenches. This is another adjustment that makes them easier to paint. I laid the duck boards into place, gave them corresponding numbers so I would know where they went, and then painted them with some spray paint. On the trench that's exposed in cross-section, I wanted to show a bit of what life was like for soldiers living in the trenches. So I made some little shelter spaces that I imagined the soldiers would have dug out to be able to lay down for a brief minute of fitful rest between the watches. I varied the revetments here, making some out of planks. I looked at a ton of reference images while doing this. Soldiers often had long hours in the trenches with little to do but wait, and many of them did some interesting things. Look at this little bar that these German officers made, for example, or the brickwork on this communication house, or my personal favorite, this little miniature setup. This one kind of messed me up because I have no doubt that that's what I would be doing. I can only hope these guys made it back to their families safely. Anyways, after painting all the exposed brickworks, I decided to add another labor-intensive detail that was a common feature in my reference photos: sandbags. Using a two-part epoxy sculpt putty, I laid sandbags along the top of my section of revetments. This not only makes the firing bays look right, it had the added benefit of creating a hard and durable edge to the sections that got this detail. I was going to do some walls that were totally braced with sandbags near the bridges and other areas, but this one tiny wall here took me almost half an hour to make just by itself, so I had to abort that. All in all, I didn't do as many sandbags as I would have liked, but it was really labor intensive and I wanted to get this first section done, and I think it looks pretty good. Now, for whatever reason, I didn't add all the bridges at the beginning, so I added the final 2 bridges, and then like before, I filled in the gaps and did some landforming with tinfoil. I added some spackle to the sides to smooth out the edges. With a palm sander, I sanded them somewhat smooth. I'm glad I did this before the next step, because I got fine white dust everywhere doing this. So the next step was another layer of mud, using the same mixture as before, but with a little bit less sand. This helped add more coverage, covering up some of the tinfoil that was peeking out from the first coat, and it gave everything a nice glutinous, sticky, muddy appearance, which is what I wanted. Now, I'm not intending to put grass onto this table. I've seen some trench tables that have that, and yes, at the beginning of a battle, there will be grass everywhere, but I want this to be like deep into the war, where the earth has been churned up by shells and mud has flown around everywhere and there's nothing living in sight. This is a grim, dark, barren wasteland, and that's exactly how I want it. While that was drying, I painted the edges with black house paint. Back inside, I painted the sandbags with a nice tan color to mimic the cloth bags the sandbags are made from. I I then dirtied the whole thing up with some dark washes, starting with watered down black acrylic paint. To complete the look of the ground outside the trenches, I made some simple structures out of bamboo skewers. These are called knife rests, or Frisian horses, and they're frames designed to hold barbed wire. Barbed wire was a pretty new innovation in World War I. It was invented in the late 19th century as a cheap way to fence in livestock, but it proved to be an incredibly effective tool on the battlefield, making an extremely difficult obstacle for infantry that couldn't be easily destroyed by gunfire and was cheap, easy, and fast to replace if it was targeted with artillery. With my knife rests painted, I add some coils of Army Painter razor wire. I wrap it around a brush to get that sort of coil-like appearance that razor wire has. It comes in these big spools, and I apply it just by sort of squishing it on in a very unstructured way. All my reference photos showed a pretty crazy tangle of razor wire. This stuff was often deployed in the middle of the night by a soldier who was probably really hurrying and scared for his life, so I think it looks right. I'm going to leave these pieces loose so I can move them around the battlefield, take them out when a tank moves to where they are, and also so I can tuck them in the trenches for ease of storage. Now with those final details in place, I'm calling an end to part 1. I'm really happy with how this has turned out so far, and I'm really excited to make the second part. I've picked up a few heavily damaged vehicles that I'm going to place in no man's land to act as cover, and I have a bunch of other cool and interesting things I'm going to do, including resin water that will fill the crater section as well. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this video, please consider joining my Patreon. The support is invaluable. I want to thank my current patrons again. You guys are the absolute best. And finally, thanks again to the sponsor of this video, Supremacy 1914. If you're interested in a free online PvP strategy game set during World War I, click the link in the description for an exclusive gift, choose your country, and fight your way to victory. We'll see you next time on Eric's Hobby Workshop.